Somewhere in China, there are entire buildings, finished, with working elevators, staffed lobbies, paved underground parking, and not a single light on at night. It's not a horror movie. It's an investment. Wide streets, no cars, glass towers, no people. It wasn't a virus that emptied these cities, nor a war, nor a natural disaster. It was a bet, the biggest real estate bet in the history of a single country, one that started out perfect and ended in silence. And the strangest part isn't that it went wrong, it's that it went right for too long. What turned such a successful bet into such a massive problem? And why should any of this matter to someone who has never set foot in China? To understand how this happened, we need to go back to a moment when China seemed to have discovered an infallible growth formula.
China's property slump is deepening. Home prices have now slid back to 2006 levels in real terms, with a downturn spreading to a record number of cities.
To China now, where home buyers, furious at the delayed completion of their properties that they're already paying for, have taken things into their own hands.
Over the past few decades, the country went through one of the largest rural-to-urban migrations in modern history, with hundreds of millions of people leaving the countryside in search of work in factories and new urban centers. After all, the population grew every single year. Who would have imagined that just a few decades later, the problem would be exactly the opposite? That rapid urbanization needed something to sustain it, and the answer Beijing found was to build, including the sectors linked to it. Real estate came to account for close to a third of everything the Chinese economy was moving at its peak, and construction investment helped finance urbanization itself, while fattening local government revenue through land sales. For decades, this engine seemed flawless. The more that got built, the more money flowed into municipal coffers, and the easier it became to finance roads, subways, and the next wave of apartments. The problem is that once this engine started turning, no one wanted to stop it. Banks offered easy credit, developers took out loans to buy land before they had even sold the apartments that didn't yet exist, and entire families came to see property not as a place to live, but as the safest financial investment in the country. Buying a second or third apartment, even one left empty, became common practice among anyone with savings, because the logic seemed simple. If prices had only gone up for decades, why wouldn't they keep going up forever? It was in this environment that names like Evergrande and Country Garden emerged, companies that grew alongside that collective belief. Evergrande founder Hui Kaiyan's formula was simple, and for a long time extremely profitable. Borrow to buy land, sell the apartments before they were even built, use that cash to pay lenders and finance the next project. Between 2014 and 2016, the company's land reserves doubled, reaching 312 million square meters, and it became the country's top developer by sales, turning its founder into one of the richest men in Asia. Companies rarely grow that fast without cutting corners, and Evergrande was no exception. At certain points, it encouraged its own employees to buy the group's financial products, an indirect way of funding its own expansion. That model only works as long as the next buyer keeps showing up. And for a long time, they did. Between the early 1990s and the market's peak, Chinese property prices multiplied tenfold, an even faster pace than what was seen in Ireland, Spain, and the United States before the 2008 crisis. In cities like Beijing, Shenzhen, and Shanghai, the ratio between home prices and household income came close to double what was seen in London and Singapore, and triple what was seen in Tokyo and New York. And here lies a detail that almost no one notices. Even in smaller, third-tier cities that had already been losing population for years, construction didn't stop. Developers kept putting up buildings in places where real demand was already weakening, simply because the entire business model depended on continuing to build. And no one seemed worried about a simple question: who would buy these apartments 20 or 30 years later? Because at that moment, almost no one imagined that China's population was about to stop growing. While brick and concrete piled up, a quiet number was eating away at the logic behind all of it. Fewer and fewer people were being born to buy these homes. In 2025, births in China fell by half compared to a decade earlier, and the population shrank for the fourth year in a row. The turning point the market didn't want to see is simple. These apartments were built for buyers who don't exist. It doesn't matter how many incentives the government offers families to have children. Not even in China's wealthiest, most developed coastal provinces does that solve the problem. There, the registered population is still growing, but only because of internal migration, since the number of births is no longer enough to replace the number of deaths. The projection is that China will lose nearly 60 million people in the next decade alone. That's the moment when the real estate market's math stopped working. Over the past decade, images of Chinese cities with empty streets and unoccupied apartment towers circulated around the world, labeled ghost cities. The phenomenon has a very literal, concrete explanation. Between 2011 and 2013 alone, China used more cement than the United States used during the entire 20th century, and its urbanized area grew fivefold between 1984 and 2010. When these cities first started appearing, many believed it was just a matter of time before they filled up. The problem is that time passed, and the population did exactly the opposite of what everyone expected. Years later, some of these cities did fill up. Pudong, for example, once called empty, is today one of the busiest financial districts in Shanghai, home to more than 5.6 million residents. But the pattern behind all of them remains the same. Build well ahead of real demand, betting that it will arrive in time. These cities were born empty, but the real disaster began when the companies that built these towers had to pay the bills for what they had put up. And the fewer young people there are to start new families, the shorter the line of buyers gets. Without buyers, developers lost revenue. Without revenue, construction stopped. Without construction, families lost confidence. And once confidence disappears, the real estate market stops holding up the economy. No company felt that collapse harder than Evergrande. Evergrande, which had reached the top of the sector, collapsed starting in 2021 under the weight of hundreds of billions of dollars in debt accumulated over years of aggressive expansion. And it wasn't an isolated case. In the first 4 months of 2022, following Evergrande's default, at least 6 other publicly listed developers also defaulted on their dollar-denominated bonds, and sales across the entire sector plunged nearly 50% compared to the same period the year before. A sector that had almost only gone up for 40 years showed right there the first signs that that trajectory was over. When developers go under, local governments, which relied on land sales for revenue, lose income too. Banks, which lent billions to finance that same sector, come under pressure from debts that don't get repaid. And the entire economy feels it. After growing 5.3% in the first half of 2025, China's economy closed the year at 4.9%. And the projection points to a further slowdown to 4.4% in 2026, driven precisely by this combination of a weak property market, falling confidence, and depressed domestic demand. And since China remains one of the main engines of global growth, a slowdown of this size doesn't stay contained within its own borders. It spreads to the rest of the world economy. But the real problem, the thing that truly separates this episode from any other real estate crisis in the past, isn't in the buildings, it's in the time it takes. Excess construction built up during a housing boom simply can't be unwound quickly. The oversupply keeps weighing on the economy long after prices have stopped rising, discouraging new investment for years on end, just as happened decades ago in Japan. The difference is that Japan, when its property bubble burst in the 1990s, was already a rich, developed economy. China is going through this same kind of adjustment while also having to deal with a population that is aging and shrinking at the same time, which makes the recovery process even slower and more uncertain. And this is where demographics and bricks finally meet. Because even if the government manages to stabilize prices, even if the banks get bailed out, even if confidence slowly comes back, one question will still remain that no credit policy can answer. Who is going to live in these apartments 20 years from now, if the population meant to fill them keeps disappearing year after year? The UN estimates that China could lose more than half of its current population by the end of the century. This isn't a crisis that money alone can fix. Money buys time. It doesn't buy people. For 40 years, building was the right answer to almost every Chinese problem. Not enough housing? Build. Not enough growth? Build even more. Now, for the first time, the country has run into a problem that no amount of new construction can solve: the absence of the very generation that was supposed to live in those homes. The towers are still standing, the elevators still work, the streets are still wide and ready. All that's increasingly missing is who's going to live in them. It's not just that there aren't enough people to work or to care for the elderly in the future. There are, quite literally, not enough people to fill the homes the country itself built. China kept building houses, but stopped building residents. For decades, China believed its biggest challenge would be building homes fast enough to keep up with a growing population. Today, the challenge is the opposite. There are millions of apartments waiting for residents, but there may never be enough residents to fill them, because concrete can be produced in a few months. An entire generation takes decades. If you enjoyed this video, follow the channel for more content like this. Share your take in the comments. Will China manage to empty out this stockpile of concrete before its population shrinks for good, or has time already run out?